Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.
Let me unmute that. Sorry about that. Welcome back to Bible Answers Unfiltered and Black Belt Theology and Apologetics. I'm your host, Dr. Al Garza. Had myself on mute there for a second. All right, so today we're going to have a very interesting show. I'm bringing on a Unitarian who I have been in conversations with privately on chats and all that for the last few months. We've had great discussions discussing Trinitarianism, the teachings of Unitarianism. Though we have opposing sides and we disagree on certain areas, we were able to at least have great conversations with each other. We both have different critiques on Unitarians and how they approach the scripture, as well as Trinitarians. So today we're going to be discussing some different things that we see within each of our camps and our groups. I'll be discussing what I see some of the issues are within these Unitarian debates and channels of people who have them, and as well as Rivers will be also discussing, his perspective and seeing what he sees on his side of Unitarians and how they approach the scriptures as well, both good and bad. So this isn't to bash either side or to criticize or mock certain individuals. We're not naming names. We're not talking about specific people in general. Specifically, we might generalize on what we see, but we're not attacking anybody personally or just attacking one position here. We are pretty much discussing everything on both sides. Now, Rivers, who I'll be bringing on as my guest, does have a master's degree in divinity. So he is well educated. We've had great conversations together. So we both have good academic background. We both are educated in the areas of our belief system, and we both study the scriptures and believe in what the Bible says, even though we do disagree on certain areas. So we will be discussing those areas, Trinitarianism versus Unitarianism. And I think it'll show that the two sides can come together. Even though we disagree, we can still come together and have great, healthy discussions between each other without mocking, criticizing, or putting each other down. So with that, I'm going to bring Mr. Rivers up here, and we're going to start getting into these areas that we've seen within each other's sides, and point out some of the good and the bad. So how you doing, Rivers?
Good. Thanks, Dr. Garza. I appreciate your inviting me to appear on your channel to discuss some things. I'm looking forward to it. I think, like you said earlier, I didn't know who you were a few months ago. I think I might have seen one of your debates, and we eventually ended up discussing some different things privately on messages, some different passages, some different things about interpretation and how Unitarians are approaching things and how Trinitarians are approaching things, and some of the pitfalls I think each side is encountering in some of these recent debates and such. So when you asked me to come on and talk about those things, I thought it might be a good conversation to have with someone with an opposing viewpoint. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in a devout Catholic home. When I was a teenager, I began to just kind of search for meaning and, of course, question some of the things that I learned when I was growing up, and my parents were beginning to give me a little bit more freedom to investigate other things. I ended up meeting some evangelical Christians who, of course, were Trinitarians when I was in high school, and went to a Bible study at my high school and started going to one of the evangelical churches in town. So I was getting a different perspective on things. And then, of course, I went on to school. And when I was in school, I just was always motivated to look at different perspectives on different issues. I think at the time, those 4 views of atonement, 5 views of eschatology, 3 views of the deity of Christ, those kind of books were popular. And so I think I probably read them all because I just wanted to see how the Bible and my faith could be understood from different perspectives. And so along the way, I picked up some of the things that I learned from my experience with evangelicals. And then, of course, I also picked up Unitarianism and some other perspectives that weren't considered orthodox or evangelical. And over the years, I've just tried to do the best I can to look at the biblical evidence objectively and just try to sort things out. One thing that might surprise some listeners is that I've always attended an evangelical church, a large evangelical mega church. At the particular church I've been at for the past 10 years, I'm their first call drummer on the worship team. So I'm pretty active and visible at the church. But my role there isn't to convert people to Unitarianism. I think one good thing about having a Unitarian viewpoint, but then having most of my friends and family being Orthodox Christians and evangelicals, is I think it gives me a little bit more balance. I see the good in those people, and I realize that my Trinitarian friends and pastors at church are sincere people, and they're trying to understand the Bible just like you and I are, Dr. Garza, but they have different input. They have a different frame of reference. Maybe they have some different fears. Maybe they have some boldness in certain areas that I don't, and they come to different conclusions. And I've just learned over the years that it keeps me focused on what's really important about the Christian life when I'm actually having to be in an environment where I can't just be in control of all of the teaching, or, I have to focus on what the real needs are of people in a church congregation, which is seldom debates about theology. So I think sometimes my persona on the internet is different, because in social media, I'm primarily engaging in critically evaluating different theological perspectives. And of course, that can be rather singular focused, and there isn't that personal relationship, or I don't know the people that I'm engaging with personally. I don't know what their needs are, things like that. So it's always good to get into a conversation with someone like you, where we take it to the next level and we learn a little bit about each other personally, because I'm sure that doesn't come off when we're debating people that we don't know on the internet.
Yeah, you're right. It is different when we're actually, even when we just watch debates, we don't really know who the people are, their life, who they are, what they bring outside of their social media channel. So when you and I were talking and we would have our discussions, we got to know each other a little bit of who we are. We're both close in the same age. I think you're a few years older than me. But we're both, we're both in that mindset of where we've come from, how we read scripture. Even though we have different views on certain topics, mainly the Trinity, we're still able to communicate, talk to each other, ask questions towards each other, and not in a way that we might, offend each other or insult each other, but respectfully have a good discussion, even off social media, like even what we're doing now, having discussion where it's not something I think where most people start getting into combative mentality, like they have to defend it so much that they have to just mock and criticize and do things because they get in a position where they just maybe feel like they can't answer. And I think that's something we're going to be talking about right now is some of the things we've seen on both sides, as far as how Unitarians have argued for their positions and even how Trinitarians have argued for their position. Because I have a lot of problem with a lot of Trinitarians who are debating and trying to defend the position with ways that I think it hurts the position more than helping. And I think you feel the same way, correct?
Yes. And, I think one thing I want to say is that, and being that you're a Trinitarian too, is I think Unitarians are obviously in the vast minority. Mm-hmm. I mean, when we're bucking the tiger and challenging what Orthodox Christians believe, and the majority of Christians who are evangelical around the world, including Catholics, it's really our burden to provide a substantial alternative to the way that you as a Trinitarian would understand biblical passages. I think one mistake that Unitarians make is that they tend to think that your position isn't derived from Scripture, right?
Right.
It comes from creeds or it comes from church fathers. But, I go to an evangelical
or Greek pagan philosophy.
Right. Or pagan philosophy. That, I sit and listen to sermons every week, and we have 10 pastors at our church because it's a very large church. They're all seminary graduates. Some of them have PhDs. And they don't talk about Greek philosophy. They don't talk about getting the Trinity doctrine from the 3 pyramids of Egypt. They don't talk about how anyone who doesn't believe in the Trinity doctrine is going to go to hell. It's not like that. It comes up, and it comes up in some of the music that we play for worship. But I don't view Trinitarians as bad people, right? I don't think I need to convert you, Dr. Garza, to the Christian faith. We have a different perspective on Christology because we look at the same biblical evidence. We sort it out differently. We're both at a disadvantage because we can't talk to somebody that wrote one of those letters or wrote one of those gospels. We don't even know who they are sometimes. And so we're all kind of looking at a crime scene from different perspectives, and we have a limited amount of evidence, and we're just trying to recreate the story that we think best fits the scene. And we have to be somewhat open-minded and considerate of the fact that not everyone has to agree with how we sort out the evidence and see the big picture.
Yeah, and I think that makes a difference. I see it this way. When we talk to people and we talk about, the Trinitarians come from pagan Greek philosophy and this, because that's how they hear it. It's no different if a Trinitarian would say about a Unitarian, you get your doctrine from the pagan human sacrifice of the biblical cultures of these groups who sacrifice humans for atonement. I mean, they wouldn't concede to that and say, no, we don't. They're not going to agree and say we get our doctrine from pagan sacrifice, old ancient civilizations who believed in atoning for sins, for offering children or human sacrifice. It's no different than how they accuse Trinitarians about pagan Greek philosophy concepts. I mean, do you see that similarity? We could easily make that same accusation to them, but we don't, because I don't believe it's true. First off, I don't see Unitarian, like you said about Trinitarians, appealing to pagans' human sacrifices for offering to gods or a god versus Trinitarians using Greek pagan philosophy, right?
Right. And by the same token, Unitarians aren't suggesting that it's sufficient for Jesus Christ to be an ordinary human being to be our Redeemer, because they have some difficulty with believing in the same all-powerful, all-knowing, self-sufficient God that you do.
Right.
It's just a matter of Christology. And I realize that probably most evangelical Christians would question my salvation or my faith because they understand that the Trinity doctrine that they derive from Scripture is that important. And I understand that. So it doesn't offend me when somebody refers to me as a heretic. Well, of course I'm a heretic because Unitarianism doesn't agree with historic Christian orthodoxy.
Right.
But the way I hear that,
Unitarians do the same thing. I mean, there's some, not all, some Unitarians who are very dogmatic and say Trinitarians have pagan views and are going to hell. So it's very similar because it's not all Unitarians, just like it's not all Trinitarians who condemn Unitarians, but there are certain groups that I've seen online where they dogmatic, even oneness people, your doctrine is sending you to hell. It's different. So yeah, I think you're right that does come across in certain circles on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, and because I sympathize with the Unitarian Christology, and I see that there is a real need for good critical evaluation, because a lot of Unitarian arguments aren't very sound. A lot of their explanations of controversial texts that Trinitarians always bring up are not exegetically valid. They're not sound logically. So that concerns me. And I realize that I'm kind of doing the dirty work because I'm always in a position of critically evaluating what they say. But I think that it's important for Unitarians who are in the vast minority to make sure that they have good arguments and they have substantial evidence, because we all want to understand that our particular view is biblical, right? It all goes back to Scripture. I don't hear the pastors of my church talking about how they got the Trinity doctrine from the church, from the council of this or that. Okay, they talk about how the Trinity is in the Bible. Right. So when they bring up passages about things that they think teach the deity of Christ, or that the Holy Spirit is a separate person of the Trinity, or that God is a multi-personal being. As a Unitarian, I feel that we need to be able to address their use of those texts at an exegetical level. It doesn't do any good for me to say, well, Dr. Garza, you just follow church creeds. That doesn't solve anything.
Right. Or pagan philosophy.
Right. When I'm trying to help Unitarians, I want them to be able to open up the Bible and be able to defend what they think is the evidence for their perspective. They're not going to win an argument with Trinitarian scholarship, right? Because as well as I do, Trinitarian scholars have different ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the issues that concerns me with Unitarians is that in order to appear to give this pretense that they're scholarly and that they have credibility, they're spending a lot of time cherry picking Trinitarian commentaries and then trying to pit Trinitarian scholars and their opinions against the opinions of other Trinitarian scholars. And then one thing that frustrates me is that oftentimes I think they misrepresent the things that they take out of Trinitarian scholarship because they're trying too hard to find something they can tie back to scholarship to make a point about Unitarianism. Let me give you an example, simple example. I've noticed a trend among Unitarians now to kind of go with that translation of John 1:1c, the word was divine. That's kind of been, I think that first appeared in the Moffat translation back in the 1930s, but it's kind of been resurrected among Unitarians. Now, understanding how Unitarians think, I think they look at that and they say, wow, that gets God out of John 1c, right? We don't have to worry about the title God, right? So then the next step they take is, well, divine, that's an adjective. So that's not a person. You wouldn't call that's not the name of a person. And then what happens is they don't realize that they're appealing to these Trinitarian scholars, some of them, or other Bible scholars who might suggest that, and the word was divine is a possible translation, which it's possible. But then most of the commentators that make reference to translating it that way would understand that divine means that the word is fully divine, like God the Father. Exactly. It's a word for deity, right? Right. It's not. Exactly. They're not translating it that way in order to minimize the deity of Christ. Right. And so it frustrates me sometimes when I see Unitarians using that way and manipulating what was the intention of the commentator and the translator. It really doesn't help Unitarianism to use "and the word was divine." It's just another way that Trinitarians can translate that clause in their favor. So those are the kind of exegetical things that bother me, and that I try to point out for the sake of Unitarians who want to be more accurate about how they're handling this information.
That's a great point, because that's one of the things that I had frustrations with as well, is that if a Trinitarian scholar decides to put divine, in their mind, they're not denying the deity or that he's God. They're expressing it in a different way. So it's not saying that the word was God the Father. It's another way of saying deity, or the same nature, or divine in the sense of being God, but not the Father. That's how every Trinitarian scholar puts it that way, even in with Dr. Daniel Wallace and other people like that. So it frustrates me, because a Unitarian will take that and then take the word divine and get it from a Trinitarian scholarship or translation that's done by Trinitarians, and then redefine it, like you said, to try and fit a lesser divine being of saying, see, he's not God, he's divine, which means in a status type position that he was put in, and which is not supported by where they're getting it from. It's just, to me, it's kind of I don't want to use an ad hoc type of fallacy, but it's very similar, because it's misrepresenting what the scholars were saying about the word divine or deity. And like yourself, that just makes me frustrated, because that's not a good argument.
No, and I think Unitarians can explain John 1:1 without having to butcher the translation. Mm-hmm. One of the conundrums that we have as Unitarians is that it's really in our best interest to work with the reputable translations that are considered to be scholarly, and in fact are approved by the kind of scholars that most Unitarians would have on their bookshelf or have to appeal to for a scholarly opinion anyway. So to me, one of the unfortunate things that I think Unitarians have tried to do is either retranslate, some public domain version of the Bible like the ASV or something that they can legally republish and just try to edit 5 or 10% of it to kind of put a Unitarian spin on some controversial passages. But I've always thought it's better to be able to open up your Bible with a Trinitarian, use any of those reputable translations they have. There's a dozen of them, and then be able to make your argument from "and the Word was God." And if you can't figure out a way to explain "and the Word was God" in a way that's consistent with a Unitarian perspective, then you need to think about something else. But I don't think, changing it to "and the Word was a God," which, objectively is a possible translation, but it's just not likely, not necessary. Same thing with "and the Word was divine." It's not necessary to change the noun to an adjective. It's possible, but it's inconsistent with the way the language is usually used, and that's why I'm hesitant. I would rather just open up the New American Standard Bible or the RSV or the New RSV or the NIV and do my best to at least meet a Trinitarian apologist or a Trinitarian friend at a place where we can agree on the text.
Right.
And then if there's some issues we have to discuss from the Greek, or maybe there's a couple other Trinitarian translations that vary a little bit, at least we're staying in the realm of using reputable translations. And
that to me is the thing of consistency. Even myself, when I debate Unitarians or non-Trinitarians, there are certain verses that I think does give credence to the Trinitarian position, but I don't use them because there are other ways to look at the text, which I know some of these Unitarians or non-Trinitarians, whether it's a oneness or not, or apostolic, can actually have a different view on it, which then I'd have to try and defend as well. So I kind of stay away from myself, like you were saying, because certain texts that I know can go in different directions, but I try to focus on the ones that I feel are a lot stronger for my position, rather than playing with texts that can be loosely, like you said, have some possible other interpretations or meanings behind it. And so it's not so dogmatically one way. And that's one thing I learned, like you were saying, is just trying to be consistent with the way we look and read scripture, and realize, like you said, even with John 1:1 or the passages, we can look at it this way, but if we can't give an answer, we can at least be consistent in how we're viewing it with other passages, and maybe, bring them the other possible understandings of the text, if that makes sense.
Right. And I appreciate, like, when a Trinitarian will occasionally admit that, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that, Jesus was an ordinary man as the Son of God, that he had a human birth, things like that. But then by the same token, I can understand that as a Unitarian, that there's also passages that Trinitarians would look at and think, well, I can't limit myself to that understanding of the nature of Christ, because these other passages seem to suggest things like preexistence, sharing divine titles, being able to exercise divine attributes and works that are extraordinary.
Right.
And so as a Unitarian, if I'm going to, meet a Trinitarian at that point of discussing some of those controversial passages, I need to have not only an explanation for those, but I have to have an explanation that, like you said, is consistent with the way I handle exegesis throughout the rest of the Bible. And by the same token, I think I need to be respectful, because sometimes my explanation of passages that a Trinitarian would use for pre-existence, for example, aren't what you might get from a face value reading of the text. And thus I have to have a very good, substantial argument for suggesting that there's a different way to look at it, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
And the burden is on me as a Unitarian, because I'm the one that's in the minority. So I respect that when I engage with Trinitarians. And I think sometimes other Unitarians think that I'm a Trinitarian, or that I'm helping the Trinitarians, but I'm just trying to give them credit for the part of the argument that they have that's strong, and not dismissing it, because it's better for me to be able to address the strength of their argument and then provide an explanation that's valid, than simply to dismiss or misrepresent what they're trying to say and then use an argument that's misdirected as if it's a rebuttal or a slam dunk reason that they can't be right about anything. And I think that tends to happen in a lot of these debates and conversations. There's a lot of misrepresentation, and then you have Unitarians sometimes preparing for these debates, and they've kind of got this idea in their mind about, I'm right about everything. This is the way the debate's going to go. I've studied my opponent. I've got all the answers to everything he said before. And then they get involved in a conversation, and some of it ends up being misrepresentation, or there's no flexibility. And as a Unitarian myself, I don't want to do that when I talk to Trinitarians and we have difference of opinions, like you and I in our private conversations over the last couple months. We talked about 3 or 4 controversial passages. We discussed our perspectives on them. We disagreed on a few things. We came to an impasse and we just moved on. I'm not going to convince you to change your mind. Everyone has to look at the evidence and consider it for himself and make up his own mind. So it's better for me just to lay out my argument, present the evidence that I'm seeing that favors my interpretation of a particular passage, and then let the audience decide for themselves whether or not it's something that they can take to heart for themselves.
Yeah, and I definitely see that perspective. Now, the idea for a lot of non-Trinitarians and even Trinitarians, like you're saying, I see a lot of Trinitarians who really are in debates who aren't really that prepared academically. They're trying to argue from their perspective without any real scholarship, and a lot of them aren't trained in the languages. They're not trained in certain ways. So I see them making a lot of errors on how they present something or how they can't answer something, and it doesn't help their cause either. It actually hurts the position, the Trinitarian position, because there's times where I've seen the debate, and the only reason I would say a Unitarian won is because they're more well prepared in their debate, prepared with their questions, with their presentation, where the Unitarian is just kind of winging it, going over the same verses that have already been discussed and refuted by Unitarians, or in their mind been refuted. So it's the same concept where I see these same things going on, where I think, why are you debating in a debate that you're not well prepared for, or if you can't give an answer? Because in my mind, I'm running through the answers in my head already, and this person who's a Trinitarian can't give a right answer, so it makes the position look even worse. And I know you notice that on the Unitarian side, but I do definitely see it on the Trinitarian side as well, as far as how they present certain positions that aren't grounded really in solid argumentation. Like you said, the man thing with the Unitarians, when they say Jesus is man, well, every Trinitarian understands Jesus was a man, but we have, of course, like you said, the pre-existent incarnation, where we say, yes, the Bible says he's a man, the man Jesus, or the one man, the mediator is the man Jesus. But that's, every Unitarian should know, we don't view that is all. So when they bring up these man arguments, like, we don't disagree with that. I mean, you can bring it up, but we don't disagree with it. We're talking about the other side, where we're trying to believe that there's another, you could say, divine side of his that existed prior to him becoming a man. And if that's the case, that's what needs to be solved. Is there or isn't there? Because if there isn't, then yes, he's just a man, and that's it. If there is, then he's more than just a man, but we don't deny it. I mean, that's kind of where I get frustrated, because Unitarians constantly harp on the man, as if Trinitarians don't believe he's also a man.
Right, I agree with you. Well, one good example of something like that is the popular, there's 20,000 singular pronouns throughout the Bible that refer to God, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we've seen that come up in these past couple of debates. And as a Unitarian, I wouldn't use that argument. Now, from my perspective, I think, yeah, there's a lot of singular pronouns that suggest that the biblical writers understood that they were referring to one person when they referred to God. However, a Trinitarian can claim the same argument because they believe that Jesus is a person, right?
Right.
So the real issue is the distinction between how Trinitarians allow for a multi-personal being, whereas Unitarians don't. The real issue is the concept of the multi-personal being. It's not that there's 20,000 singular pronouns, but a lot of Unitarians, they're only looking at some of these arguments from a very topical, superficial sense, and they don't realize that they're using the wrong information to address the wrong issue.
Yeah, and I agree with you that 20,000 plus, and it's something that I think gets overstated a lot because Trinitarians can easily say, well, there are tens of thousands more than that of singular nouns used as understanding as plural. All the names of the nations of Israel and Judah are all singular when they speak of them in the prophets as singular pronouns, but they represent a nation or people, but they're spoken of as a he or a she or I or me or my, and these are nations. So does that mean a nation is one person because they use the pronoun I, myself, or God says you to them in singular? I mean, it's Trinitarians understand the linguistic aspect of the Old Testament, that just because it's a singular pronoun doesn't mean they can't be more than one. It depends how we define what the singular pronoun. Just like if I have the nation, if Israel says, I have sinned against you, well, is that Israel speaking as a single person or an entity, or does Israel represent a nation of people? It's the linguistic background that we say if we find Yahweh speaking of himself in singular form, we have a problem because we have other passages in our view that show him speaking in plural forms, or he's addressed as plural forms, or in the name Elohim as plural, or Adonai as plural. They have third person plural pronouns attached to those singular nouns to make it plural, addressing it to Yahweh. So at least we're trying to be some consistency, that we're not just throwing out a random 20,000 personal pronouns. That's it, undefeated. I mean, it's like, wait a minute, can we address the other side of the fence here and not just looking at it that way? You know what I'm saying? If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I think you and I have talked about this before privately, is that languages are flexible. They're dynamic. You know, when we're reading the Greek and Hebrew in the Bible, it's unlikely that we're reading exactly the same language that they would have spoken.
Right.
There's differences. And I think we talked about this as well. I think one of the best pieces of advice that I got in school from my advisor was, when I was young, of course, I really wanted to understand the Bible. And I thought, well, the way to understand the Bible is to go to seminary and just take Greek and Hebrew classes. Right.
Right.
And I was glad that I had an advisor that said, no, you take a little bit of Greek and Hebrew, and then you take semantics, and you take logistics, and you take logic, because those are the things that help you to understand how the language works. Anybody can memorize the Greek alphabet. Yeah. Anybody can look at an interlinear and look at the parsing and make up an explanation. But really understanding how the language works and why translators come up with the definition of words and the phrases and clauses that they use to transfer the language from Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic into English. That's what's more important. You have to be able to look at how the language is used. It's not, I think we talked about this the other day. One of the bad trends I see among a lot of biblical Unitarians is they just open up a concordance, Trinitarian one like Strong's, of course, and they look at a list of definitions for a word like logos, right?
Yeah.
And then they scroll down and they say, you know what, dear Dr. So-and-so, told me that that logos is where we get the word logic. And then they try to plug that into John 1:1. And then the first thing I asked myself is why did no Bible translator over the last 2,000 years plug logic into John 1:1? Because it's not the right translation. You don't use a dictionary to give you options for interpretation, right?
Yeah.
A dictionary just represents all the different ways that a word could be used. And I think a lot of Unitarians and even Christians in general don't understand that, lexical sources represent usage outside of Scripture. And they also represent uses of words over hundreds of years. So when you're looking at the prologue, you can't just pick logic or thought or, any of the 15 definitions of logos that you're going to find in Strong's Concordance and then think that it's the right one to plug in. And if people would just look at how Bible translators at least start by just using word and then dealing with that, it would just make the world a better place.
Yeah. And I think even what you were mentioning as far as lexicons is being, or concordances, not being able to, even if they advance themselves to certain lexicons, I see even Trinitarians and Unitarians misusing it, not knowing how to use it correctly, missing the key points of what the lexicon is trying to say, in either comparing it to scripture or even non-Christian sources. And I see that a lot on both sides. One side tries to use it a certain way. The other side doesn't know how to use it either, so can't refute it and can't answer it. So they go back and forth with a lexicon, and neither one can read it correctly. And I've noticed that because they don't understand what they're reading with the lexicon. They look for what they want in the word. They find it and say, oh, here's probably what it means. And they don't understand either when it cross-references an outside biblical source trying to support the other position or not. And the other side of the camp doesn't know how to correct that because they don't know how to read it either. So you got two people who can't read a lexicon. One's referencing it or the other one's referencing it, and neither one of them can correctly read it accurately as scholars meant it to be used in a certain way. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Well, I was just thinking of an example that came up in a recent debate, and the Unitarian in the debate tried to make the point that, well, the Hebrew word davar, and of course logos that was used to translate it in the Old Testament, never refers to a person. Okay, now I'm thinking about this as a Unitarian. So first of all, it doesn't logically follow that if you're a Unitarian and you believe that Jesus didn't exist until the apostolic era, what difference would it make if the Hebrew word dabar didn't refer to a person? I mean, it's not even a sensible argument. It's self-refuting. Okay, well, all that matters and I think this individual was alluding to the prologue, but all that matters is what the writer of the fourth gospel was using logos to refer to in the context of the prologue. It doesn't matter how it was used in the Old Testament. So right there you have a fallacy because you have a Unitarian individual changing the context and unfortunately just making a self-defeating argument.
Yeah, and I see the other side. The other side can't answer that correctly because a Trinitarian should understand how logos is being used in accordance with the memra or davar Yahweh in certain Hebrew construct form, and at least be able, if they can, which they should be able to demonstrate. If you believe that the word is a person in the Hebrew scriptures, then show it. And if you can present it and show a clear distinction between the word Yahweh and Yahweh as being distinct, then that needs to be presented. And I don't see Trinitarians doing that because for me, they don't know enough of the language within the Hebrew, the culture of the Aramaic, the time frame. So for me, they can't defend it when they should be able to, or at least present it. Like you said, if a Unitarian says it's not a person in the Hebrew Bible, the word, and they just cite it, the Trinitarian, if they're well versed in the Bible, should be able to say, well, let's look and see if that's true and present the case or the argument, and they don't. And that's the other side of it, is that they're not doing it correctly. On both sides of the fence, I think, and this is where you and I agree, is that I think both sides misrepresent our positions in these debates or in these discussions. And even some of these chats that I'm seeing here in our comment sections, I see people still doing the same exact thing. In fact, I think they're calling our things, one person here who's always in my channel calls it staged. This feels staged and fake. I mean, I don't know that this is the same attacks we get with, they just criticize, mock, and belittle by saying that you and I are doing a stage thing. This is fake. I don't know if you can see the comments or if you're looking at them.
No, I can't see them because I'm on the StreamYard. But
okay, yeah, I you might have been YouTube. Yeah.
Since we alluded to the prologue, I mean, you and I are a good example. I'm one of the lesser percentage, I should say, of Unitarians who accepts that the word should be capitalized in the prologue in John 1 and John 1:14 because the Greek grammar and the context indicate that it's referring to the name of a person. Now that's a very hard thing for most Unitarians to swallow.
Right.
And I've tried for years to get them to understand that you have to get your exegesis right. Okay, you can't just have the mentality that you don't want the word in John 1 to be a person, right?
Right.
And so many Unitarians just have that mentality, and they won't take the time to realize that all the same Trinitarian scholars that they're cherry picking in these commentaries and lexicons capitalize the word in John 1 and John 1:14 because they recognize that the Greek grammar and the context indicate that it's referring to a person. Now, that doesn't mean that it always refers to a person, but it's context that determines meaning. All right. If the prologue demands that the word refers to a person, then we capitalize it in English, just like we understand in John 1:29 and John 1:36 that when John the Baptizer points to Jesus and says, "This one is the Lamb of God," we capitalize Lamb of God because we realize in that context it's referring to a person. It doesn't matter if a lamb was ever a person in the Old Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if other lambs mentioned in the New Testament are animals. The important thing is what the writer of the fourth gospel and John the Baptizer that he's quoting meant by the Lamb of God in that particular context. And to be honest with you, I don't understand why that's so difficult for Unitarians. I don't have any trouble explaining my way through the prologue by recognizing that that Trinitarian scholars are right and their translators are accurate, and that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That Word is a person. I have no problem with that. But I think it's important as a Unitarian for me to recognize that being able to agree or find common ground with someone like you, a Trinitarian, by at least admitting to the most accurate representation of the text is a better place to start, rather than anathematizing you or bringing in these ridiculous ad hoc paradigms like wisdom, Christology, and agency, that have nothing to do with deriving an accurate translation or interpretation of the prologue or other places in the fourth gospel. And to be honest with you, I think it's rather amusing that this wisdom Christology trend that's kind of come up among Unitarians, they apply it to the fourth gospel, which doesn't even use the word wisdom. They apply it to Philippians 2 to try to get away from the pre-existence implication, and Philippians doesn't even mention wisdom. And then they apply it to Hebrews chapter 1, where they're trying to get away from deity of Christ proof text, and he doesn't mention wisdom either. But they try so hard to find what they're looking for in these passages that they'll even now, some of these Unitarians will go to the extent where they impose a paradigm that's not only anachronistic, but has there's no connection whatsoever to what the authors of these particular books are talking about. I mean, it should be a big red flag that you don't even have the word wisdom. You don't even have a citation from wisdom literature in the fourth gospel. And yet you're going to impose a wisdom Christology paradigm and suggest that that's the umbrella under which we need to define words that writer used and understand what he was saying. And then, it just happens to be a means we can use to diminish pre-existence texts. And I think you've encountered in your debates, it doesn't work.
No,
because when you ask them to explain John 17:5, or you ask this kind of Unitarian to explain John 1:1, they talk about wisdom Christology.
Right.
They don't talk about what the Greek grammar is in John 1:1 or what the implications of the translation of John 17:5 is.
Right.
Okay. And that just concerns me. I'm just being honest as someone who's a Unitarian who's sympathetic to what they're trying to prove. It's just a really unfortunate approach that doesn't work.
I think it's the same way also that I've encountered very similar to that, where they're using wisdom Christology agency for everything. Now it's agency this, agency that, which there's no, verb or something that states I'm an agency of so-and-so. They just imply it. But the other issue that I also have is the fact that they're now adapting that, okay, so what if Jesus called God and Yahweh? Okay, I agree he could, but it's by predication. The predication argument is everything is by predication. Even though it doesn't directly say this is by predication, of course. It's just like the wisdom, Christology, agency. Now it's by predication. So if we concede that Jesus is Yahweh God, they'll say, well, yeah, I could agree. He's definitely called God there, or he's addressed as Yahweh, but that is by predication. Okay, I think you can come up with a better argument than that than by just simply keep using predication, wisdom, or agency, Christology, just like the 20,000 pronouns. I mean, just there's got to be something, and I say this on the other side as well, who give bad Trinitarian arguments. Trust me, it's no different because I see it the same way. On your end, that what you've seen, do you constantly see that as well? That new ideas are developing to try and answer these questions?
Yeah, but what I see, unfortunately, among Unitarians is a lot of ad hoc explanations, because the problem is that there are no scholars in the UCA. There are no Trinitarian scholars in America, in my opinion.
Right.
Okay, I only know of one legitimate Unitarian scholar who's over in the UK. With that said, that creates a problem, because you have people that are not only relying on Trinitarian scholarship, which opposes their views, but I don't get the impression that there are people who have the skills to critically evaluate the information that they're getting from a lot of the lexical resources and commentaries that we're talking about. So they're cherry picking things out of those books and online resources, and then they're developing ad hoc explanations like wisdom, Christology, and agency. And it's funny, because you brought up agency. One of the things that boggles my mind is that most Unitarians would sit here and tell you that that the word Trinity is not in the Bible. Neither is the word agency, right? There's no word for agent or agency. Now, if you search that in 20 Bibles, you'll find a couple of Bibles that will use it or add it in italics. But there's no word in Hebrew or Greek that corresponds to the way that most Trinitarians, most Unitarians, and even some Trinitarians are applying the concept of agency. Right. It's another ad hoc, unnecessary use of language. Just leave it sent and send, right?
Right. Exactly. That's the point. Yes.
There's no reason to make it agency. And I think it was interesting one time when I watched an old debate, and there was two Trinitarian scholars. It was on a TV program, and then there was a Unitarian, really notable Unitarian, and then he had a Jewish guy with him, I think, for some credibility. And I remember the Jewish guy brought up during this debate the Shalia principle, right? And I remember it showed on the screen of the debate what the Shalia principle was, because, of course, he got it out of a commentary on the Talmud or something like that. And it plainly said in the definition that he gave that it refers to a legal transaction. It doesn't, sending your daughter to the grocery store with $10 to buy chips for you is not agency. Right. But it's gotten to the point with Unitarians where they think that agency is all over the Bible, even though it's never mentioned.
Right.
And to be fair, Trinitarians, as you know, sometimes do that with the Trinity too. Yes. So I've heard Trinitarians say, well, the deity of Christ is all over the Bible. Well, come on. That's kind of an overstatement. I mean, you certainly have places where you would defend the deity of Christ from the Bible, but it's an overstatement.
It is.
And just for the accuracy of communication and translation, I don't know why Unitarians, quite honestly, would just discard the idea of agency. It doesn't explain why Jesus is called God. And I don't know if you know this, but that's where that ball started rolling. Is people thought, well, if Jesus is an agent of God, then he can be called God in certain passages. Because I don't, but some Unitarians would, concede that John 20:28 and Hebrews 1:8 and, one or two other passages are directly referring to Jesus as God. I don't think that's necessary myself. But then what happened is they decided that this agency idea, well, the agent supposedly assumes the identity and the title of the person who sent them to be an agent, right? Which is not what that means, right?
Well, it's not what it means, but also it's not how it's even used in the Old Testament. When a prophet or someone is sent by God, it's spoken, it's thus saith the Lord, and they're speaking his behalf. You don't have them being addressed or saying, by the way, they're not going to the prophets or the one who sent, saying, calling them by God's name or as God or addressing him that way at all. I mean, it's like you said, they are developing a method to try and answer these verses, which I think you and I would agree that there's better answers or better ways to approach it than just throwing in agency and all these things that don't exist in scripture, like the word Trinity as well. But yet they are applying these principles that don't exist as if they exist. And the example you brought is like going to, I think one example I saw the Unitarian do is, oh, if you order a pizza from Papa John's and they come and knock on your door, they're bringing you a pizza from Papa John's. But I'm thinking, okay, but they're not claiming to be Papa John, or I'm not calling them Papa John, or,
Right.
they're not saying, hey, I'm Papa John, here's your pizza. No, they are delivery for the company, and it's clear, but no one's calling that delivery man Papa John. Or he's not, I'm saying he's not calling himself Papa John in that sense, or being recognized that way. So
Right.
that to me is it doesn't work. Those examples don't work.
Right. And I think, it's interesting when we're on this subject of agency too, is one thing I see Unitarians doing as well, is that they'll say, okay, well, you Trinitarians are using language like Trinity or, homoousia, language like that was, clearly developed after the apostolic era, right? And
Right.
maybe there's no counterpart to those terms in scripture. But then what they do is they say, well, we see in the Talmud, which is what, 2nd century probably, so it's after the New Testament, and they find this Jewish law of agency, and then they figure out, well, this is a way that we could, use it to defend some of these passages about where Jesus is called God, and then what they do basically is it's anachronism, right? Just like they're accusing the Trinitarian of doing. They're saying, okay, we're going to take this word agency and we're going to go back and find it all over the Bible because it helps us explain away deity of Christ proof texts. They're doing the same thing, and that bugs me, because you can't accuse your opponent of being anachronistic and your opponent of using unbiblical theological jargon that originated later and then do it yourself.
Right.
And for the life of me, I can't understand why that isn't obvious to the average Unitarian that they're doing that. And we mentioned the wisdom Christology earlier. This is one of the interesting things too. In one of the recent debates, I remember the individual that was appealing to the wisdom Christology mentioned that there was 100 years of scholarship behind his studies of the wisdom Christology, right? So where does that put the wisdom Christology paradigm? In the 20th century? So isn't it? So he wants the wisdom Christology to be the solution to his difficulty explaining away pre-existence and other difficulties in the fourth gospel. But what he's basically saying is that I'm using recent scholarship, and then I'm going to make it anachronistic and go back into the apostolic era and decide that this is how the paradigm by which they were operating.
Right.
And the other issue is it's anachronistic from the other direction, because when you're taking wisdom Christology from books that are hundreds of years earlier, and then you're putting them into the fourth gospel, into the prologue, and then restricting the definition of words that were used by a writer hundreds of years later, that's also anachronistic. It works both ways. And as long as we're on the subject of wisdom Christology, I think you and I were talking about it, and I told you I'd give you 10 reasons that wisdom Christology doesn't work in the fourth gospel. So I'll just throw them off the top of my head. First of all, the term wisdom doesn't even appear in the Johannine corpus at all. Revelation, the letters, the book of John, or the fourth gospel. There's no citations of any of the wisdom books that wisdom Christology people use to defend that paradigm anywhere in the fourth gospel. As everyone knows, the wisdom was a feminine term used for personified as a female companion of God in the
Proverbs
wisdom literature, whereas the term word in the prologue is a masculine term referring to a person, Jesus Christ. There in John 1:1, where it says, "And the word was with God," the Greek grammar there, hein pros theon. There's no proston theon in any of those wisdom literature texts that they use. the was God language in John 1:1c that we alluded to earlier, and the word was God. Wisdom is never said to be was God. And
Right.
there's no reason to think there's personification in the prologue. I mean, one thing I think Unitarians don't understand is when you claim that something is personification in the prologue, for example, you have to be able to demonstrate that, number one, the prologue, that personification is necessary to understand the prologue. Number two, you have to demonstrate that the intention of the writer was to use personification. So what happens is not only do you have to interpret the prologue correctly, but you have to demonstrate that your two presuppositions are valid. So you're just making it worse for yourself. Anybody that comes along, like a Trinitarian, like Dr. White did in a recent debate, can just go through the Greek text of the prologue and explain it without appealing to influences from external sources. It's already a better answer. I mean, I would favor a Trinitarian reading of the prologue over a wisdom Christology approach, just on the basis of the quality of the methodology.
Right.
Here's a couple more reasons. Besides no personification in the program, wisdom literature has no concept of embodiment. I don't think, some people understand that that's another word that doesn't correspond to anything in the biblical languages. They didn't have a concept of embodiment. So when you introduce embodiment into the prologue, I think a wisdom Christology advocate would say that John 1:14 is what about the embodiment of God's created speech or something. Well, there's no embodiment concept in wisdom literature or in the biblical languages. That's another problem. All right. I think terms, this is a big one too. Terms like the beginning, word, light, life, darkness, they're too common. They're very common Greek terms that are used in all kinds of historical and religious texts, and they have all different meanings in different contexts. So you can't take what they might have meant or how you interpret that they might have been used in wisdom literature and then impose that paradigm on the prologue and decide that the writer of the fourth gospel has to use the beginning, word, light, life, and darkness that particular way, when anyone can go through the Bible and look up any of those words and see that there's 20 different ways they were used. So again, that's another reason why it doesn't work. Another big reason I can think of off the top of my head is that the fourth gospel is not even wisdom literature in the first place, right?
Right, genre, yeah.
Right, it's not the right genre, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, that's 9 or 10 reasons just right off the top of my head that it just doesn't work. And it's interesting too, because like I alluded to earlier with methodology, if you go through the, 20 or 25 proof texts that they'll use to claim that wisdom Christology is underlying, the prologue or the passages in the fourth gospel, one of the problems you encounter is you have to interpret every single one of those wisdom texts. And not everybody agrees on what wisdom 7:26 was saying, or what wisdom 9:1 and 2 was saying, or Sirach 4:16, or Sirach 1Q20. Not everybody interprets those passages the same way. So then again, you run into the issue of complicating it for yourself, because as a Unitarian, then not only do you have to demonstrate that your particular reading of these wisdom texts is the best reading and is accurate, but then you have to go the next step and try to demonstrate why those interpretations of those wisdom texts and how that language was used has to be the way that the writer of the fourth gospel intended it. And of course, we don't know who the writer was. We don't know when the book was written. We don't know who the audience was. So you really have a mountain to climb. And it's a shame when I hear this, case for wisdom Christology or agency presented by some of these Unitarians, that people just fall for it quick, because they just don't have the understanding of the methodology behind imposing a paradigm like that, and being able to ask the right critical questions to evaluate it. So unfortunately, that's kind of the state of some of the Unitarian debating and apologies right now.
Yeah, they definitely hold. I mean, for Trinitarians, obviously, we have a different actual, as you know, we definitely interpret John's gospel not as obviously not connected to any type of wisdom type genre to narrative. We do, Trinitarians always hold to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, early church acceptance of these writings from the apostles. So we do have Trinitarians have a different tradition of understanding the text for us. But to re-identify the text into a genre that doesn't fit, that is the issue that Unitarians will face if they don't stop doing that, because it does. And I made this case myself in other videos, is that it's not the same. You take Proverbs or even intertestamental writings and trying to take that and apply it into John's narrative or the book of Genesis. These are not the genre of wisdom type literature. These are giving you historical narrative and discussing, pretty much a typology of history without having to apply wisdom literature. And it's not there. And just like the other examples that you brought up with agency and everything else, trying to impose that, or even by predication, trying to impose these non-existent terms is no different than how they accuse Trinitarians of using. You say Trinity is not there, or you say this and it's not there. I mean, it's very similar, because some Trinitarians do the exact same thing. They apply certain aspects of type of anachronistic words, you take it from here and apply it into the Bible. And the big thing now is dealing with the laws of logic and all these things with the laws of logic, and how the laws of logic have to be followed, and they're importing that in over the Bible, and you can't do that. Laws of logic will never fit in the Bible, because there's nothing that follows the law. You're talking about virgin birth and miracles and resurrection and things like that. Those don't follow the laws of logic. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
those are outside the natural realm.
That's a great point, and that it disappoints me a lot as well with Unitarians too, because they'll accuse you, like you brought up earlier in our conversation, of getting your ideas from pagan Greek philosophy or from Plato, right?
Right.
And yet, most people understand that the father of formal logic, which a lot of Unitarians are relying on for their arguments, was Aristotle, and Aristotle was a pagan Greek philosopher.
Right.
But the difference with Aristotle is that Aristotle, at least in my understanding, was smart enough to realize that formal logic can't account for everything. It can't explain everything.
Right.
There are certain categories that aren't explainable. And they're supernatural phenomenon that all ancient civilizations believed in, including Aristotle and the Greeks. So they knew that formal logic couldn't account for that. So yes, I mean, not to completely invalidate using logical syllogisms when you're making arguments in a debate against Trinitarians, but it's not sufficient. And like you said, I think that's where a lot of the misunderstanding comes in, because the Unitarian will set up a syllogism based on their understanding that Jesus is a man, right?
Right.
But in the back of their mind, they're thinking that you think he's a God man.
Right.
All right. Therefore, their syllogistic argument defending that he's 100% human somehow is sufficient to rebut your argument, when they're not addressing the same thing.
Exactly.
Right? Because you don't believe that he's limited to being a human being.
Right.
So you don't have to accept the limitations of that logic. So that's why I don't think that route is easier to go. But I suspect that sometimes Unitarians, again, because there's not a lot of accountability, and there's no real peer-reviewed scholarship in the ranks. I think part of the reason this happens is because they latch on to something like these logical arguments, and they don't think about the implications. Like you alluded to, they can't explain supernatural phenomena in the Bible. How are they going to use formal logic to explain a talking snake, right?
Right.
Or an axe head that floated, or the resurrection? It has its limitations, but they get so narrow-minded about how it's going to refute that Trinitarian opponent who thinks that Jesus is a God man, that they lose perspective on the implications that that approach is going to have on other aspects of theology and biblical interpretation. You can't get carried away with it. It's not enough. You can make that argument and say, this is why I think it's there's a better reason to believe that Jesus is an ordinary man or 100% human, but it's not sufficient to counter the objection of a Trinitarian who's going to allow for Jesus also to be fully divine at the same time. That's a different issue, right?
Yes, and I don't like Trinitarians who appeal to mystery of God. When they say, "Oh, the nature of the Trinity is a mystery," that is no, because what you're doing is you're opening the door to get this other straw man of saying, "Oh, a mystery, so it can't be explained." So the whole Bible's. It says, look, there's a degree or to a point of we can see in Scripture what has been revealed. Like you were saying, like we talked about the resurrection, the talking animals, all this stuff. That goes beyond the natural realm, and there is a degree of mystery of how God did that, because it doesn't tell us this is how it works, like the virgin birth. This is how it works. So there is a small degree of mystery, but to say it's all a mystery, or for Trinitarians to appeal to the mystery of God and who He is and what He's revealed about Himself, to me is a deep flaw within Trinitarianism. Because for Trinitarians in my position, I think there are better ways to answer by showing and demonstrating where Moses talks about the persons of God, and God talks to Moses about His persons not being seen and all these things in the Hebrew. But to say it's a mystery and then blanket it, I think that opens the door for a lot more straw mans, where people can come in and accuse us of, like, a lot of Unitarians on the other side, many of them, not all of them, but some of them will accuse of, "Oh, it's a mystery. Show me in the laws of logic where this doesn't, And it's like, no, we do have mysteries in the Bible when it comes to these things of miracles and virgin birth and resurrections and talking this and all this stuff, parting of the Red Sea and fire and bushes that don't burn. I mean, we can't explain them in the naturals, but we can understand they are being revealed and explained to us and showing us this happened. So we don't explain. And this is something I think also you would agree is that's the arguments that atheists and agnostics make against the Bible. If you can't explain it, do you really believe a bush can have fire or not burn? So you believe that fairy tale? It's like, well, we believe what it says. We can't explain it because we weren't there. We don't know exactly how that worked because it's beyond the natural. So there is a degree of mystery to how God did that, but the Bible says it, so we don't question it. Whereas an atheist or agnostic would turn around and use those same type of arguments to dismiss the Bible. So for me, sometimes Unitarians on the other position will use the arguments of atheists and agnostics against the nature of God, and don't understand that argument can destroy the whole Bible as a whole if you want to take it to its full logical conclusion. And I think you've experienced that yourself with some of these arguments with that, same way of how they use that why stop there? Why not keep going? Right. I mean, take it to its full extent.
Right. And, one thing that's helped me a lot with biblical research over the years is that sometimes we debate things or question things like the virgin birth that you alluded to that were not of any question to the apostolic writers. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, like you said, the skeptics, they'll make a big deal out of some discrepancies between the gospel narratives with regard to the birth of Jesus, or, whether, Joseph was or Jesus qualified as a descendant of David, or whether Joseph was considered his real father. The first question I ask myself as a researcher is, where was the debate back then?
Yeah.
There was nobody disputing that information that they put in those gospels. These gospels were circulated presumably to people who knew about Christ and knew about the disciples and the other events that took place. And there's no reason to think that the writer would just lie about something or put misinformation in there. He may not have had all the information, and that's why there are some discrepancies. But there's no reason to think that anyone was debating whether or not there was a virgin birth during the apostolic era. There's no reason to think that anyone questioned that Joseph was the father of Jesus. There's a couple of passages where he's called the father of Jesus, right? And the genealogies as well. So that's an important thing, because that's where you get anachronistic issues being imposed on the Bible.
Exactly.
I'll give you another one. This one's a little more controversial, but when I'm on other platforms on social media, this is kind of, since we brought up skeptics, this is one of the skeptic things that seems to come up a lot, is they throw the slavery argument out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why does your your wonderful God of the Bible, why did he tolerate and advocate slavery? Well, why did every other civilization in the ancient world tolerate and advocate slavery? And some of it was worse.
Yeah.
But see, the skeptic who wants to think that, well, this is an attack on the Bible, doesn't think about the implications for the rest of history, right?
Right.
Or,
even to the
or
modern
even,
US.
yeah, or even with regard to the supernatural. Skeptics a lot of time will question supernatural things in the Bible, which is reasonable because there's a lot of them that we can't account for today. But every ancient civilization believed in supernatural things, recorded it in their books and on their pyramids and everything else. And so if you undermine the Bible on the basis of questioning something like the supernatural, then you basically remove all the cultural content of ancient history.
Right.
Because it's every civilization that did it. So you got to be careful with, again, taking, it doesn't, and I don't mean to say this in a way to disagree with our modern understanding of the immorality of slavery, that in modern times it's immoral, right? But you can't impose that particular notion of morality back into ancient times. It's anachronistic.
Well, and not only that, but it's a fact that in biblical times it wasn't slave, it was servant in the Hebrew, and in those who were captured and made servants were treated very well versus throughout the last 200-300 years when slavery was more brutal. Back then, you treated them as one of the households, you took care of them, as a servant. They were more of a servant, and then after so many years they can be released depending on how they were in the times of season. So even then, the biblical narrative of a servant rather than slave is, if they captured and made them servants and they were allowed to, then they can keep them as servants and take care of them under their own protection, as well as after so many, I think it was 7 years or longer, they can be released. So even then, it's not the way people want it. They will, like you said, anachronistically take the way slaves that were treated by other nations and countries, even throughout the Ottoman Empire and within Europe. And they want to brutalize that same concept and throw it into the Bible when they weren't doing that for the most part. It wasn't looked at that way. If so, historically, it's not really the same. As far as looking at how the Israelites and how the Hebrews, kept servants when they caught them and how they treated them. But let me show you something. I want you to see something here. Sure. I'm going to bring up this comment here. If you can, let's see here. It's this one. I knew you're resourceful, but to do this is so cheap. Guess after Dustin Smith's debate, you thought you have to step it up with this. Not too cool. If you got to stage fake opposition, shows your character. So this person thinks that you are a staged person, maybe a Trinitarian who's, staging all this. And then he concludes with this part here saying, sir, you don't have to do most. What's the other one here? This is so staged, controlled opposition. Two Trinitarians pretend to be opposing, sir. The fact that you got to do this is cheap. You got to live with this choice, though.
I'd suspect you're right. It's probably a Unitarian.
Yeah.
Let me just respond this way. First of all, I don't like intellectual pretense. Okay. Mm. I don't like false sophistication. I don't like people that throw around theological jargon. I don't care about metaphysics. I don't care about philosophy. I don't care about who's got the fancier shoes at the debate, right? I'm an exegesis guy. I don't like that. And I'm not a hero worshiper. So, dropping somebody's name from the UCA doesn't, affiliated with the UCA doesn't bother me. I'm not affiliated with the UCA or any other Unitarian organizations. I'm an independent researcher. I'm providing critical evaluation, which I think is for the benefit of Unitarians because I sympathize with their perspective.
Right.
And that's why I'm having this discussion with you. We started at the beginning of this conversation by making it clear that we have different positions on Christology. Right. We don't agree with each other on how to interpret a lot of the controversial passages, but we also both recognize that both sides of the debate are straw manning, misrepresenting, using illogical arguments, using fallacies. And I think you and I are both, especially with our background with some training in linguistics, you and I want exegesis to be done accurately
Right.
and interpretation to be driven from a respect for the text and from understanding how the original ancient Hebrews, Jesus and the apostles, would have understood what they were writing.
Right. And it's historical context, and that's the point, is people like this individual posting here, which he is a Unitarian because he posts me all the time with the Unitarian arguments. He makes the same assumptions, even with you, even though you're being completely honest in the situation. We've made it clear, you and I, we both oppose their oppositions, but to show that we can come together, and if we are civilized discussing these things, one of these people, like Clark Cam 52 here, he's the one who's going to accuse you, even though I speak against the Trinitarians and how they argue. He has to make you a Trinitarian, or you're fake, or you're this, or you're staged, or whatever, because he feels he's being threatened by you exposing some of these weak arguments that they're presenting and not following through, in the same way I would say with the Trinitarians. But here's one person who does have a question on this. He says, what is your advice on going to college or university to study Hebrew and Greek? How do you get certified in those languages? I'll first answer that saying, for my part, there's great online, if you can't go to a college university that provides it, there are online schools that you can look at. Hebrew University has a linguistic program through the Israel Institute of Biblical Studies. It's a live classroom where you are interacting with your professor of Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic. It is costly because it's a live 4-credit course through Hebrew University, but it's in linguistics. Or you can do the Israel Bible Study Center has programs. You can, unless you can go to a college university that offers certified programs that are accredited from for teaching Hebrew or Greek, definitely do that. But again, be careful, but try to find one that gives you a good online foundation that's fully accredited, even like I said, Hebrew University or others online. What do you think, Rivers?
Well, you're you're much more qualified to give a recommendation than I am in that area. But like I mentioned earlier in our discussion, I was just grateful that when I went to school and had the idea as a 20-something that by taking 4 years of Greek and 4 years of Hebrew classes was going to make me an expert in the Bible. Mm-hmm. I'm just glad that I had a wise advisor who told me to take a year of each language and then take courses in logic, semantics, linguistics, which is a lot of what you and I have been talking about. Because it's more important to understand how the language works and also to realize that languages are flexible. That's more important than understanding how to recite the Greek alphabet.
Right.
Or that's more important. When I was in school, I remember we had flashcards because we didn't have a lot of internet stuff and we didn't have YouTube. So we had flashcards. And I remember for one class that I took, I think it was my second semester of Greek, I had to memorize 300 Greek words with flashcards. So we would sit in the lunchroom and I probably don't remember 285 of those words.
Yeah.
Okay. But I understand how to work with the biblical languages a lot better because it was not memorizing grammatical things that helped me to understand the language. It was actually the courses in semantics and linguistics that helped me to use the materials that are available to remind me about things I learned about the languages, like the lexicons and commentaries that we've been talking about, so that when I open up the Bible and read it in English, or I look at the original language, I understand how to evaluate what I'm looking at. Not that I can open up Leviticus and just start reading it in Hebrew.
Right.
And what I said earlier about being pretentious, I really feel that because Unitarians are the underdogs, like myself, I put myself in that category, it's in our best interest to rely as heavily as we can on just making an argument from any Bible translation that the average person that we're appealing to can open up and see for themselves. That's why people know when I write comments and have these conversations, I don't bring up lexicons and commentaries. I don't refer to scholars. I don't say I've got 4, commentaries on the book of Colossians and this is what I think they say or what I think it thinks. I just try to make precise, articulate explanations and arguments from what I think that the average person can open up their Bible and see. And to that person who questioned whether I'm a Trinitarian or a Unitarian, I'm certainly a Unitarian. And if I was having this conversation with a Unitarian that was talking about wisdom Christology, I would be pointing out the same things.
Right.
But I would also offer an alternative explanation that's consistent with a Unitarian Christology along with it. I wouldn't be defending Trinitarianism, but by the same token, I certainly wouldn't be defending a flawed, anachronistic, ad hoc paradigm that is useless in as far as I can see in terms of actually really understanding the prologue or the fourth gospel or the book of Hebrews or Philippians chapter 2. There's better options for Unitarians.
Right. You're right. I think there is. And to Tony's point, who asked the question, you need the language is part of the foundation. Like, and then also you're saying Jewish culture and context, looking at, the linguistics of the time frame and the background, all these things we need to consider. The languages help. They do give some insight, but again, you have to understand the rest of it as well. The Jewish culture and context of that time, the linguistic genres of the scriptures of how they're being used and applied, and of course, looking at it and getting training in those areas, because it's the language is not enough. It does help, it does lay a foundation, but you have to go beyond the language. And I equate that to my life as far as when, I look at, because my background heavily is in martial arts, when you get to a certain point in martial arts with your certain belt rankings, let's say you get to black belt, it doesn't stop there. You get there, but it's what happens after, all the experience and the what comes after that actually makes that black belt worth what it is. Because you could be a black belt hanging up and that's it, but there's nothing behind it after that as far as experience and knowledge and what you can show from it. So language is great, but you have to go beyond the language. Just because you can pick up a Hebrew Bible and read it doesn't mean you understand it. It doesn't mean you know what it's really saying.
Yeah, just so people can understand what we're saying. Let me just give a quick example. Okay,
Yeah.
We've brought up word a number of times. So sometimes I'll hear Unitarians, they'll talk about the word logos, right? And this just happened yesterday, I think, when I was on a thread somewhere on Facebook having a conversation with someone. But they'll go into a lexicon, or even actually, I'll give him credit. I think he went and actually did a search of the New American Standard Bible or a modern translation to look at to show me all the different ways that logos is translated, right? Because I was impressing on him that translating it word, which is how it's most often translated, is the most accurate way to render it in the prologue, right?
Right.
But so he brought up, I'll just give a couple of examples to give the listener an idea of what we mean when you have to understand how to evaluate the language, not just look at definitions. So he showed me, logos, I'm thinking off the top of my head, one of the passages he brought up, it's translated account, right? Another passage he brought up, it's translated message. Another passage he brought up, I think it was translated reason. And this particular individual, he liked reason because now reason is abstract, right?
Right.
So if you translate it reason in John 1:1, then you don't have to think it's a person, okay?
Right.
But here's the thing. When you see logos translated with word, message, account, preaching, reason, doctrine, you have to go look at the context in which those translations are done. And then you ask yourself, well, why does logos appear in all these contexts that where these different English words are found? And then the next step is you think and you say, well, what do these words have in common? So, an account, you can give an account verbally, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can give a message or hear a message verbally, right? You preach verbally. Doctrine is passed on verbally sometimes, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then reason. You and I are reasoning right now, right? When we discuss issues, and it's a verbal conversation. That's what's underlying the translation. That's why the word logos is used, because logos, all 300 times in the Bible that it's used in the Greek scriptures, Old and New, you can look them all up. Every single one of them is in a context where there's a verbal expression involved of some sort, whether it's two people reasoning, whether it's somebody preaching, whether it's somebody giving an account of what happened to them, okay, whether it's referring to a message, all right? the underlying thing that you look at when you analyze the usage of the word is what do all of these uses have in common that's prompting these different translations. So the next step is then you say, well, it's translated reason in that one passage in the book of Acts because it's talking about somebody giving their understanding or their knowledge or their explanation of what happened. So then when you go back to the prologue, you can't just say, well, since it's translated reason there in Acts, I think I'll plug it into John 1:1 and just have it mean reason in some other sense. See, that's what happens when you look at an interlinear and you see the word logos, but you don't really understand why it's being translated certain ways and why the particular context determines the sense in which the word is being used. And another good example with the wisdom Christology we were talking about earlier, that language where it says, and the word was with God in John 1:1b, that, as you know, Dr. Garza, there's 5 or 6 or maybe 7 different prepositions in the Greek language that are just translated with in English, because with in English is a word that can be used in a lot of different contexts, and it doesn't have any different forms. It's just with, right? So what happens, I think, to a lot of Unitarians is that they read and the word was with God, right? And they see that English word with, and then they go back to these, let's just use the wisdom Christology as an example. They go back and they find 20 or 25 passages in wisdom literature that use with, and then they find a couple of those that use word or that use wisdom, all right? And they don't take the time to look at which particular Greek word or prepositions are being used in those Greek versions of those wisdom texts. And they don't realize that the one used in John 1:1b is relatively uncommon and is a specific way of saying with God that has personal and mediatory implications. It's always that particular prepositional phrase, proston theon, with God, or was with God, hein prostos theon, that's used in context where there's always another person involved with God. And that's why it's not used in the wisdom literature. So someone who doesn't understand how to evaluate the language, it's real easy for them to look at that English word with in John 1:1b and then think that they can go back into wisdom literature and find that the word or that wisdom was with God and just assume that it means the same thing.
Yeah,
I mean, even
exactly.
in the fourth gospel itself, there's 5 or 6 different prepositions for with.
Right.
And they all mean something a little bit differently. And there's a reason when you see an uncommon one, like proston theon, that only occurs there and then in John 3:13. When you see an uncommon one like that, then you have to ask yourself the question, why did the writer choose that particular prepositional phrase in that particular context? What was he trying to say that was different than the dozens of other times that he used the ordinary, more common prepositions for with throughout the rest of the book? So that's just an example of how you have to go beyond just saying, okay, it means reason because there's one verse in the book of Acts where it's translated reason in English, and not ask yourself the right critical questions about why it's translated reason in that particular place, but why that may not affect the way it's translated elsewhere.
And that's funny because you brought up, like I said, even within the lexicon itself, if you look at the lexicon and you find where that word with is used in the lexicon for that particular verse in there, not just broadly looking for all these different interpretation or translations. If you see it used in there, and it even give you used in John 1:1, or how it's used, it'll tell you, like you were saying, most times it's used as to be in company with someone else, and it gives New Testament examples of people being in company with other people, and so it explains with that verse, and in much of the Hebrew understanding is using the Hebrew for next to God, with God, in that sense of being in company with somebody else. But I take it a step further because John's gospel goes beyond just the word from the Old Testament. Because if I said we look at the word, if we just generically look for word in the Old Testament, like you said, we're going to find it's used for different ways. But if I look for the expression or the way of the word Yahweh used as appearing to Abraham, appearing to Elijah, appearing through as within a construct chain with the proper noun Yahweh being definite, Devar Yahweh. In Hebrew, this signifies that the word is Yahweh and Yahweh is the word. They're connected. They're joined with the two nouns being that way as being both definite in Hebrew. And it even has a makif, which is a connector bar that makes it vocally or to be pronounced as one word. So I go beyond just saying, don't look for the word, look for where the word is applied with the name Yahweh, grammatically where it's used as one word, and then look for, is this used as showing that this is just Yahweh as the word, or is this a different person other than Yahweh? And then I take them to 1 Kings 19, where I showed the word Yahweh appears to Elijah in the cave on the mountain, and they're talking, and they are having a conversation where the word tells Elijah, "Hey, what are you doing here, Elijah?" And then Elijah speaks to him about, your prophets are doing this, and they're killing the people, and they're breaking your covenant and destroying your altar. And the word Yahweh tells Elijah, go stand before Yahweh, who then passes by. And then has the same conversation when Yahweh speaks to Elijah, says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And so I always tell Unitarians and Trinitarians, you need to go beyond to see, do they show, the scriptures show a distinction of persons within the word Yahweh, and not just the word by itself, but how it's used with the name Yahweh to identify either Yahweh or another person, like in 1 Kings 19. So I always take them to go beyond not just the lexicons, but how the scriptures read, as what we see with Genesis 15 all the way through even to what Elijah. So there is a starting point, and then there's an ending point where we eventually have to say, how is it being used in connection to Yahweh when they're joined together as one word?
Right. Well, that was a mistaken notion, I think, that was pointed out in one of the recent debates, is that it's really not fair, as you've alluded to simply say that, well, word was never used in the Old Testament to refer to a person. Because like in 1 Kings 19, I agree with you. There's a handful of passages, maybe more, where there's, I think, pretty clear indication that the word of the Lord is being used to refer to a person who's delivering the message. Now, we don't have to agree that the person was Jesus or that it was the word as the second person of the Trinity, before the incarnation. Okay, I would argue that it's just referring to an anonymous messenger like an angel. But from a linguistic standpoint, the important thing is not to disqualify the evidence in passages like that indicates that when the word of the Lord came to some people, that was their way of expressing that there was a messenger that delivered it. Sometimes I think Unitarians don't stop and think that, words don't just magically happen out of thin air.
Right.
All right. A voice comes from a mouth. A mouth comes from a person that has a corporal body. Right. And so I think that all has to be taken into account. Or it's like in Genesis 3, I still don't understand how this God's creative word that a lot of Unitarians talk about in Genesis 1:3, I don't know how that sprouted legs, right? And a mouth and walked through the garden. I mean, did something sprout legs and then just speak out of thin air? Yeah. No, there's some kind of a corporal entity there. And in my opinion, again, it was probably a cherubim because they're mentioned as being, in the story. Right. But you may see it differently. But those little hints, like walking and talking and pointing and taking him outside, right? Some of those are hints that the narrator is just assuming that there's a person involved.
Right.
And there's no point from a Unitarian perspective, we can explain it without ending up with the Trinity or the pre-existence of Christ. So there's no reason to just miss the forest for the trees by ignoring legitimate exegetical evidence that someone like you would point out. That means we need to be flexible. We can't just say, well, logos and debar never refer to a person anywhere in the Old Testament. That's just an ignorant, naive statement. Right. Because somebody hasn't done enough research to realize that there are other options and that there's flexibility.
See, and that goes to our discussion. I mean, what you present is saying, well, you hold maybe as a messenger. So, okay, we can then discuss that as far as, once we break that error of saying nowhere is the word ever spoken as a person, and
Right.
once you get past that, even if your interpretation that you have of, let's say, 1 Kings 19 or other passages, now we can have a real discussion on, let's determine, is this a type of agency or not even agency, a type of messenger that comes or sent by, or as a Trinitarian would say, is this, a second person to us being described as the word Yahweh, separate from Yahweh, and so forth. So that is where now we can start being honest and say, okay, at least we can acknowledge this is someone there. We can disagree on who that person might be, but we don't say there's no person in the Old Testament who's identified as the word or a person as a word, because that's just blatantly untrue. I mean, even the Jewish Aramaic Targums understand that the word is usually is always the word memra is always replaced with either Elohim or Yahweh in the Old Testament, where it's the memra, the word who created man in his own image, or in the beginning it was the word who created the heavens and the earth. So even they interpret these passages as being a word associated with God doing these things. Now the question we have to ask and find out is this separate and distinct persons, or is this something different that we have to look at? But at least we can come to the scriptures now honestly and say, okay, you might say it's a person, I say it's a person, but this type of person. So now we can at least have a common ground to work on than just saying, nope, there's no such thing as a word as a person in the Old Testament. Doesn't happen.
Right.
I mean, that's
and the word in the prologue, right?
Right. Exactly. Yes.
If we eliminate all the wasted time that Unitarians commit to trying to talk themselves out of the fact that the word is referring to a person in that particular context, just like it does in Revelation 19:13-15. Even if you don't believe the rider on the white horse is Jesus, it shows that somebody was called by the name of the word of God, right?
Exactly.
So you can't preclude that.
Right.
So that, so let's say you and I agree that the word, which we do, is referring to a person, is properly capitalized in John 1:1 and John 1:14. Now we can deal with the other stuff, right? In what sense was that person with God, right? When was the beginning when that person was with God? What does it mean when the one called the Word was God, right? What does it mean when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us? And that opens a whole bevy of interpretive options. But for us as Unitarians and Trinitarians, if we can't even find common ground on the word being a person in the prologue, then the conversation is just going to appeal to one side or the other. There's not going to be any progress, right?
And I think they feel that for the one that Unitarians that aren't really educated in that area, I think if they concede to that they've lost for some reason. Like, oh, if I concede the person, then I'm going to lose. Then the Unitarian's out the window, as if they can't bring up another argument like you're bringing up or another possibility. So they feel if they do concede, they lose. So they go to ad hoc a lot of times of just trying to discredit it with their own view without no real source behind it, because they feel if they do, it might just destroy their argument. When, as you were saying, no, we can have common ground on the truth of what it's saying and then go from there, right?
Right. Or we could have common ground on the fact that, logic doesn't explain everything. Right.
Exactly.
So I can give you a little flexibility and say, you know what? God is supernatural, right? And he does a lot of supernatural things. And a lot of supernatural things happen in the Bible that we can't simply explain with formal logic. So let's at least have some flexibility. Maybe because God fits in that realm of supernatural, maybe you have some reason to believe that maybe, formal logic is not sufficient to limit your explanation of God, right? But you still have this issue of the being person distinction which is what I would focus on, because you need that to establish, some of what leads you to believe in the preexistence of Christ and the triune God and things like that. But that's really where the meat of the argument is. If I just sit here and say, well, it's not logical, it doesn't work with this syllogism, we're not going to get anywhere, because you don't have to accept my logic, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and if I answer your logic, if you say, give me a logical reason for the Trinity or give me an example, I can give you one. It doesn't mean you're going to accept it because you're just going to dismiss it. Because again, you feel if you concede, you lose the argument, which is not the case. You can concede
Yeah,
and
that
still
happens too.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair assessment on your part, because I've spent hundreds of days in plenty of forums trying to get some feedback and some interaction with Unitarians about the prologue and seeing it as referring to a person. And there's still very few that can even dialogue on it, because they just have not only do they not have any desire, in my opinion, to dialogue it or to concede it, but they just don't have any capacity to look at it any different way. It's like it's a salvation issue almost.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
You know,
And that's
like I
both.
saw a guy today. I saw a guy on Facebook today, and he went through the whole prologue, and his idea was that the word in the prologue is the Torah. You know, I think he's one of these Torah observant Unitarians. You know,
I've heard that. Yeah.
so he's got this whole list, and it's interesting because I looked at it, and the first thing I realized is that all the passages that he's using to define logos as the law are from the Old Testament. Number one, wrong context.
Yeah.
Number
exactly.
two, not a single, he had 2 or 3 passages for every one of his points through all 18 verses of why it's the law. Not a single one of those is cited anywhere or alluded to in the prologue or the fourth gospel. So again, it's just like the wisdom Christology. It's like, what are you thinking? Okay, you determine a writer's meaning by looking at the way that he uses the words. You don't bring in an entirely different context and then list a bunch of proof texts where you think the Old Testament defines all these terms, and then decide for yourself that this unknown author of the prologue must have been defining them that way.
Right.
Because that helps you with your, not only your Unitarianism, I suppose, but also your Torah observance, right? It's obvious that it's theologically motivated. And I know the person has good intentions. You know, I'm not trying to be, detrimental to a person's character, but it just shows that it's the wrong methodology, and the person isn't using good critical thinking skills.
Right.
They're just compiling data to substantiate a belief that they already have, that they're already predisposed to. Now, you and I, if we approach the prologue, right, we agree that Jesus, or that the word is referring to a person. Now, obviously, we're going to presuppose some things. I'm going to make some assumptions. You're going to make some assumptions. But that's why we dialogue, just to test, because we don't know everything. We can't talk to that anonymous writer and have him explain how simple it was and how we both missed the whole point of the whole damn thing, right? But when you and I dialogue, we have to, and I have a feeling that's going to happen someday, is we're going to sit down with Jesus and we're going to find out that all of us were 95% wrong, right? And the apostles are probably going to be chuckling, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I think is going to happen. So we have to have some mutual respect, and we have to agree to when our opponents have a valid argument. I mean, I don't see any way around what Trinitarian scholars have presented as the accurate way of translating and recognizing that the word in the prologue is a person. I don't think I can get around it. So I don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's the honesty of the whole thing.
Yeah. So and we're going to, but we're always open to interpretation. So you and I might sharpen each other. I'm probably not today going to convince you. If we started a discussion on the prologue, you probably wouldn't convince me. But believe me, sometimes I listen to debates. When I listen to debates, I'm actually more interested in what the Trinitarians have to say.
Yeah.
Because I want to know that you're looking at a passage like 1 Kings 19, the way that you look at it, because I'm not going to hear that passage from a Unitarian, right?
Right. Nope.
Yeah, exactly. And if I listen to when I listen to a debate and they're talking about a really, a controversial passage, like let's say John 8:58 or John 17:5, I'm more interested in what you have to say about it, because I can hardly find a Unitarian who can explain it.
Right.
So I actually get more benefit from listening to opponents, and you're always going to get the best critical feedback from an opponent, right? Because he's motivated to dismiss your argument. So I would much rather, have a dialogue with an informed opponent that can help me to see things that I might be missing, simply because I don't I make different assumptions, or I have blinders on to certain things, or maybe somebody that has a better understanding of the biblical languages like you would, maybe some things that I would overlook. I would much rather have that kind of feedback rather than, than just blindly defend, my position because I'm a Unitarian, right?
Right. And that's better feedback, even on the other side. Like you said, when I listen to debates, I'm always listening to what the Unitarian has to say. I mean, a Trinitarian, I know what they're gonna argue for, but I want to hear what the Unitarian has to say. That they're gonna say something new, something different, something I can look at. I'm always looking, like what you say. I'm looking for the other opponents and what they have to say. That helps me to understand their position better, to see where they're coming from. But if they're doing the same type of fallacies and arguments that you pointed out on that end, the way I see Trinitarians do, then that just makes me keep shaking my head like, come on, you can do better. Just like a Trinitarians. Guys, there's some Trinitarians I see on there that should not be debating. I know they have social media, so they feel like they can pretty much just go on there and debate because they have a channel and now they can do that. But what they say, because they have no formal training at all, they don't have it. They just kind of listen to other people's Trinitarians comments and repeat the same things. It doesn't help. It makes it worse. There are Trinitarians, I'm going to say, should not be debating, period. If you're not formally trained to understand the languages better, and if you're not prepared in a way that you need to be, look at scriptures, read the lexicons, read the Jewish context, culture, and all those things, then please don't debate. Don't do it, because it does make, just like you were saying, the Unitarian side, they do it, makes them look worse, makes the Trinitarians look worse. Both sides, to a degree, should not be debating to a certain point.
Yeah, I'm kind of in an interesting situation, I think, because I'm sympathetic to the Unitarian side of the debate, but they can't accuse me of believing in three Yahwehs.
Right. And I think that's why they don't like you.
Right. They just don't like me. Right.
They don't like you. I always hear the worst about you. That we saw criticizing you about other things. Oh, this guy, let him tell you about this, or this guy's this, or, it's like, please, he's a Unitarian. Just because you have disagreements with him, he's calling it like it is, the way I would call out a Trinitarian who's giving bad arguments. Okay. You can't accuse me of other things when I'm telling you, you shouldn't be giving bad arguments, step it up a little bit, do better. That's the point.
Right. Yeah. But I just, I just think with Unitarians, I really think they're at the point where they need to be having internal conversations amongst themselves because one of the disadvantages, I think, of being a Unitarian is that if I asked you and 4 other Trinitarian apologists about the Trinity doctrine, I'm going to get the same explanation from all 4 of you. If I asked 5 Unitarians to explain the prologue, I'm going to get 8 different answers.
Yeah.
Because there's going to be 5 people that have bizarre explanations, and then there's going to be 3 of them that don't know what to think.
Right.
So they're going to have 3 different explanations, or they're going to say there's a double meaning, right? The classic pop out, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that can't be the case, because especially Unitarians, if you're looking at, or Trinitarians, if you're looking at these debates and trying to kind of understand, the best arguments for a Unitarian perspective, or kind of where Unitarians are coming from, and then you listen to one lecture at a Unitarian debate and the guy's arguing that the prologue has a Gnostic background, and there's some guy named Serenthus that knew the Apostle John, and light, dark, word, those are all Gnostic current terms, right?
Yeah.
That the writer of the 4th gospel was using to help communicate the gospel to people that were infested with Gnosticism. Then you get another guy that comes up and says it's all wisdom Christology, right? And he does the same thing. He goes into wisdom literature instead of the Nag Hammadi. He goes into wisdom literature and he finds word and light and darkness and God, all these common Greek terms, and then he redefines them all according to that background. Yeah. So you're a Trinitarian listening to that, or I'm listening to it, and I'm like, you have to go beyond that and say, well, what's wrong with the methodology here? Why are 2 different Unitarians who are fairly well known that I'm alluding to, why would they come up with 2 different lectures at a Unitarian conference that are completely different background stories and ad hoc explanations of the same passage? Yeah. And then they wonder why you're, the guy with the backwards baseball cap that's wants to be a YouTube creator, why he jumps on there and just parrots what they say, and nobody gets anywhere,
Nope.
And it's just Unitarians need to get together, find some leaders, and sit down and hash out amongst themselves something that's going to give them more credibility and more stability when they give opposing responses to Unitarians. They can't be given 5 different answers to John 1:1 and 3 different answers to John 17:5, and then expect anyone to think that there's any consistency or credibility behind what they're trying to say. Yeah. Instead of worrying about debating you, they should be debating amongst themselves about, what's a better option for all of us. And if we're putting ourselves in a position of leadership and teaching other people with these channels and these self-published books and things like that, these conference lectures, they really need to come to grips with having a more unified and credible position on a lot of these controversial texts that come up in every single debate and get fumbled one way or the other.
Yep,
because
I agree.
People aren't prepared to give an informed answer a lot of times. And it's, as a Unitarian myself, as an independent looking in from the outside, it's too bad that this is happening, because I think all it's doing is creating a mutual admiration society amongst the 1 out of 10,000 people that happens to be a Unitarian and connected to the UCA, right? So I really don't think nothing is breeding innovation or anything that's going to move the Unitarian argument forward at this point.
Well, here's what David said. David made a comment. He says a lot of Unitarians shouldn't be debating and teaching. Same on the Trinity side. 100%. I think we both agree with that. I think we both could say yes, that is true. But then he also says, on top of that, he says, good luck with that, Rivers. The Unitarians don't usually want to work together. I think there's some point where the Unitarians, just like Trinitarians, are looking for their own best interest on what they can do on social media. Like you said, grow it, live off of it, try and make it something else, rather than trying to come together and learn, come up, like you're saying, hash these things out and figure it out before, going out there and just coming up with all these different perspectives and views that aren't recognized. I mean, even David at least got it right at that point.
Yeah. And I think, I remember when the UCA, this Unitarian Christian Alliance, I remember when they formed, 5 or 6 years ago, and somebody reached out to me about it, of course, and told me about what they were doing. I mean, all I saw they were doing is reinventing the wheel. There was already Spirit and Truth, which is a kind of a charismatic Unitarian organization that's been around for decades. And then, of course, Anthony Buzzard and his Restoration Fellowship. They're a Unitarian ministry that's been around for decades. They have been trying to do the same thing for 30 or 40 years or more that the UCA is supposed to be doing, right? Mm-hmm. So all these Unitarians, this small group of Unitarians are doing is dividing themselves, and they're also having an issue because there's only limited funds, Right. I mean, people aren't going to go to 3 or 4 different, Bible conferences every year for the same Unitarian message because there's 3 different organizations putting them on, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
That's why they don't, that's why they can't raise the funds they need and things like that, publish books and all this other stuff that they were planning to do, because they're too small of a group, and they're defeating themselves by dividing further and not seeking to have more unity on what they're going to present as a theological argument. Trinitarians, by virtue of their history, have kind of done that. I know there's different models of Trinitarianism and things like that, but you ask the average person at my church to tell you, do you believe that God is 3 persons in one? They're going to say yes, whether they understand it or not, right? If you ask them if Jesus is God, they're going to say yes, right? Whether they can explain it or not.
Right.
Okay, if you ask them So you need to be able to go to a Unitarian in a conversation and say, hey, what do you guys say that John 17:5 means? And there shouldn't be 3 different versions of an explanation, because that just that doesn't help, especially when you're talking to someone that believes that they already have an explanation that works perfectly well, right? Yeah. Like your explanation would be.
Right.
So it's just it's the state of things. It concerns me. I think Unitarians misunderstand that I'm just trying to do the dirty work of constantly providing, high level critical feedback. And sometimes it's not pleasant, but I'm trying to get people to think about what they're saying and think about better options, and not to, dismiss Trinitarians as worthless pagans that are polytheistic people, not to keep telling them that they believe in 3 Yahwehs when they've said three. You guys on debates really should get a t-shirt that says I believe in one Yahweh.
Yeah.
How they got the one, how they got the one
Yeah.
God hat, the bald
Yeah.
Trinitarians put on all the time in their videos that says one God. Just do one Yahweh. You guys got to do something like that. Have a sense
that would drive them crazy.
Yeah, because it's getting ridiculous. Yeah, then they would tell you that you shouldn't be wearing the hat, right? Because you're lying, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately, that's how it's become. But
it is.
I don't mind. I mean, I don't have a shoe in the race, so I'm just I'm happy to dialogue with someone like you. Maybe we can have another conversation sometime and deal with the prologue or something. We know we're going to disagree.
Yes, actually, that would be good. We can pick a specific topic. I know we were kind of winging it today of talking about the issues between both sides and kind of going over what we see within both parties and the wrongs and rights to both sides. So I think next time we could do something like this and pick a certain topic of the prologue or something, and then discuss it, how we would view on both sides, how you see the prologue, how I see the prologue, how you see something in a specific passage, how I look at it. And we can kind of just discuss it and see, okay, let's follow what the scriptures say and bring everything we can to the table without just saying, nope, it's not this, it's not that. And, going into all these weird ad hominem attacks or ad hoc or everything else. I mean, I think that'd be great for the next time.
Yeah, I think some of these verses are pretty fascinating. Like, just think of John 1:14. I mean, the language.
Yeah.
That Greek verb dynamai.
Yeah.
That has such a wide semantic range that, there are options for a passage like John 1:14. I can see where became flesh would sound like incarnation to a Trinitarian. I can understand that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can see where, I could see where a Unitarian might think it means embodied because we think of the body as flesh, but there's other options, that a word like that, or even in John 8:58, where it has ginomai again, where it says, before Abraham becomes, or
was born,
however you want to translate it, I am. That's another word that has that word ginomai can mean a lot of different things can happen. It just means things happen. So whether it means birth or whether it means, coming on the scene. I mean, even in the prologue, ginomai is translated 4 or 5 different ways, just in the prologue, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I enjoy discussing options of interpretation for passages like that because I think we can get closed-minded real fast simply because we don't recognize how broad. That's a particular word that has a broad spectrum, much broader than logos or Sophia, wisdom or word. So it's that's why I keep working with it. I mean, I have an unusual understanding of John 1:14 from a Unitarian perspective, but I've considered other options, and I'm just trying to sort through some things, and that's what sits best with me right now. But I realize there's flexibility. I might learn something from you if we discuss the prologue in detail someday that'll tweak my thinking or help me to understand something a little bit better that may or may not benefit my view. Right. That's right.
And hearing your perspective would help me as well, at least hearing the other side of it in a different way that has not been brought up, and how you're looking at it from a perspective that can be better understood and explained from the language and from what it says. That does help. So it helps other Trinitarians see a better perspective of the other side rather than just, like you said, closed-minded. This is it, it's done, even though it doesn't follow at all anything. Right. Well, let's do this, Rivers, because it's getting on the 2-hour mark, and I want to keep you and keep myself and my family. We're getting on 2 hours, which I think is a great thing to start off with. And I think in the future, we can definitely get together and figure something else out to discuss, like you said, a prologue or something we can, discuss to hammer in on, and then bring both sides of the perspective in view and say, okay, how would a Unitarian like yourself look at this without bringing in all this extra stuff that, other Unitarians bring in, and how I, as a Trinitarian, would look at this in the view of how I see it within Scripture. And without the other Trinitarian type of dialogue. And maybe, like I said, we can give people something to see and learn rather than just the same standard old arguments that a lot of times don't work. What do you think?
I agree. All right. I appreciate that you invited me to come on the program. It was great having a discussion with you.
And I appreciate you.
It'll be beneficial to people that listen.
Yeah, and I guess I appreciate you taking the invite and wanting to come on, even though we haven't really talked personally. We mainly do through messaging and chatting, so we didn't really have a conversation. This is our first time conversating like this live. So I know you had some reservations, like, okay, what are we gonna do? You know, I can tell you had some reservations, like, okay, how's this gonna go? But I'm glad we did, and we can definitely do this again. We'll talk again later and kind of figure out something if we want to come on and bring a specific topic on and go from there. And but yeah, let's do that. Let's give the people something different than just the same old, sometimes bad arguments on both ends that should not be, and maybe help some people out understand the positions better. Sound good?
Well, yeah, I agree. And one of the reasons I don't do debates is because I think discussions are better.
Yeah, me too.
You wanted to have a discussion about some things, and that's
right.
One of the reasons I was happy to come on the channel and do that with you, because I think we get more out of a discussion than a debate.
Oh, most
especially
definitely.
when it's the same redundant thing over and over again with the same people.
Yeah, so, exactly. And
hopefully this was a fresh conversation that'll give people different things to think about.
It's a start. So it's a good start for us, because like I said, debates, I don't like doing debates. I will do them just to bring out the other side more clearly, and I like them. But I rather have discussions because it's more open and without the interruptions and the problem, and you could pretty much go any direction with it. And as long as you're both willing to be respectful, then I think discussions are a lot better than debates. Definitely.
All right.
Well, Rivers, I will let you go off the chat. You're welcome. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to close with, or are you good?
No, I think we talked long enough. I think the president's given his.
He is giving it State of the Union. All right. Well, I'll let you go. I'll put you off. I thank you, Rivers, for coming. I appreciate it. And again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I know I got some of the old people on here with some of the old Unitarians just hammering away. This was a discussion just to introduce Rivers to the people out there, because I think he could bring a lot to the table that the Unitarians are not bringing, that I think could help a lot. So this was kind of a starting point so that I can have more conversations with the Unitarian that's more sensible, in the sense that he's willing to concede certain things of the scriptures that say without having to give up his position as a Unitarian. I think that's important. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. This is Bible Answers Unfiltered and Black Belt Theology and Apologetics. So thank you, everybody, and God bless.